The Hells Angels biker saw the little girl dragged into an alley, and his ruthless rescue split the night open. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. A cold wind blew through the empty streets of the city as Jake Reaper Morrison cruised down the sidewalk, his Harley-Davidson rumbling beneath him. The leather jacket that adorned his broad shoulders gleamed in the moonlight, reflecting a lifetime of battles, both on the road and in life. He had always been a man of action, never one to back down, never one to hesitate. His Hells Angels patch wasn't just a symbol of a club, it was a badge of honor, worn by someone who had seen the worst of humanity and always stood tall in the face of it. It was nearly midnight, and the streets were eerily silent. Jake preferred it this way, the quiet only broken by the steady hum of his engine and the occasional howl of the wind. But tonight, something felt different. The usual hum of the city was absent, and instead, a faint cry carried through the stillness of the night. Jake's sharp eyes scanned the surroundings, instinctively locking onto the alley ahead. His mind raced, trained to recognize danger before it was visible. The sound grew louder, a voice filled with fear and desperation. "Please no." The words sliced through the air, pulling Jake's attention like a magnet. He made a swift decision and steered the bike toward the alley without a second thought. As he approached, the dim light from a street lamp illuminated a small figure struggling against the grip of two men. A little girl, no older than 8 or 9, was being dragged by the arms, her face twisted in terror. She fought with all her might, but her small body was no match for the men's strength. Jake's heart tightened as he took in the sight. He could hear her pleading, her voice a pitiful whisper. "Please, help me." Without hesitation, Jake slammed the brakes, his boots hitting the ground as he dismounted the bike. The sound of the engine dying down was replaced by the chilling silence of the alley. The two men turned their heads, startled by the sudden presence of the biker. The girl's eyes flicked toward Jake, her fear escalating as she saw the rough biker approaching. Jake's reputation had preceded him, and he knew it. He was a Hells Angel, a figure that most people avoided at all costs, a man who inspired fear rather than comfort. But the little girl didn't know that. To her, he was just another stranger, someone who could just as easily hurt her as help her. "What's going on here?" Jake's voice was low, gravelly, the kind of voice that made people listen. One of the men sneered. "Mind your business, old man." Jake didn't move. His eyes locked onto the man, calculating his next move. "I don't think so," he said, his voice cold and unwavering. The tension in the air thickened as Jake took a step forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the men. The girl's terrified eyes met his for the first time, and Jake saw the raw fear in them. He couldn't just stand there. Without warning, he lunged, grabbing the arm of the first man with a force that sent him stumbling backward. The second man tried to swing a punch, but Jake was faster. With a swift motion, he knocked the man to the ground, his body slamming against the pavement. The sound of the punch echoed through the alley, followed by a moment of stunned silence. The girl gasped, her small body trembling as she watched Jake take control of the situation. He turned toward her, his face softening for the first time that night. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle, a stark contrast to the cold demeanor he had shown the men. She nodded, still in shock, her wide eyes not fully understanding what had just happened. Jake offered his hand, but she hesitated. "You're safe now," he reassured her, kneeling down to her level. Slowly, she reached out and took his hand, her tiny fingers gripping his rough palm. Jake stood up, pulling her to her feet. He could hear the sirens in the distance, and knew he didn't have much time. "Come on, let's get you out of here." As they moved toward his bike, Jake glanced back at the two men lying on the ground, still groaning. He wasn't sure if they would come after him again, but he wasn't going to stick around to find out. The girl climbed onto the back of the bike, still trembling, but with a sense of security she hadn't had moments before. Jake revved the engine, and they sped off into the night, the sound of the Harley cutting through the silence like a warning. The city faded behind them as they disappeared into the unknown, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt something other than the weight of his past. Something lighter, something more human. The night had split open, and so had something inside him. The ride back to the garage was long and silent. The girl, still gripping Jake's leather jacket tightly, sat behind him on the Harley. Her small body trembled against the cold wind, but she never let go of him, as if he were the only thing holding her to this world. Jake didn't mind the silence. In fact, he welcomed it. It was better than the chaos of his thoughts. He had been a Hell's Angel for years, a man used to violence, to danger, to the raw, unfiltered side of life. But this moment, with a trembling little girl behind him, felt different. It felt like something important, something that could change everything. They reached his garage just before dawn, the orange glow of the rising sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. The place was run down, a relic of the past, much like Jake himself. He had spent countless hours fixing bikes here, building his life on the rough edges of the world. But today, it felt different. Today, it felt like a refuge. Jake parked the Harley and turned off the engine. The girl hesitated for a moment before sliding off the bike. She was still too shaken to speak, her eyes wide and searching, like she wasn't sure whether she had escaped her nightmare or if it was just beginning. Jake pulled the bike into the garage, then turned to face her. "You're safe now," he said, his voice softer than he expected. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to reassure her. Maybe because, deep down, he wasn't sure if he was safe either. The girl nodded, but her face was still clouded with fear. She looked up at him, her eyes full of questions she didn't know how to ask. "What's your name?" Jake asked, crouching down to her level. "Mia," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mia," he repeated, his heart tightening. "All right, Mia. You're gonna be okay. I'm gonna make sure of that." He stood up and walked toward the door of the garage. "Come on. Let's get you inside. You must be freezing." Mia didn't move at first, still hesitant, as if she wasn't sure if she should trust him. Jake turned back, meeting her gaze. "Hey," he said softly. "I won't hurt you. I promise. You don't need to be scared anymore." She looked at him for a long moment, then slowly walked toward the door. Jake opened it and led her into the warmth of the building. The inside of the garage smelled of motor oil and dust, a familiar scent to Jake, but one that probably felt foreign and intimidating to Mia. He quickly found an old blanket from one of the shelves and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Here, this should help warm you up a bit." She took the blanket hesitantly, her fingers brushing against his for a moment. Jake could feel the cold in her touch, and it made something inside him tighten. He couldn't remember the last time he had cared this much about another person, let alone a child. He had spent so many years hardened by the world, by the violence, by the loss. But this little girl, was different. She had seen things that no one, especially not a child, should ever see. Jake could tell by the way she looked at him, like she had been through something so traumatic, so painful, that she couldn't process it all. "You want something to eat?" he asked, trying to break the silence. Mia shook her head, though her stomach growled loudly. Jake raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Mia nodded, her eyes darting around the room as if she was waiting for something. "I'm not hungry," she said softly, but Jake could tell she was lying. He could see the way her hands trembled, the way her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. "All right," Jake said, choosing to let it go for now. "But if you change your mind, let me know. I've got some food in the fridge." He stood up and walked toward the counter where a few beers sat next to an old kettle. The kettle was ancient, but it worked. He heated some water and poured it into a cup, then turned back to Mia. "Here," he said, handing her the steaming cup. "It's not much, but it'll help." Mia took the cup, her fingers shaking as she held it. She didn't drink from it immediately, though. Instead, she looked up at him, her eyes full of questions. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake felt his throat tighten. He didn't know the answer to that. Maybe it was because he saw something in her that reminded him of his own childhood, of the times when he had been lost and needed someone to save him. Maybe it was because, deep down, he knew what it was like to feel abandoned, to feel like no one cared. Or maybe it was because he had no choice. Mia needed him. And for the first time in years, Jake didn't mind that he had to be the one to help. He leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe because you remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who needed help, just like you do." Mia didn't say anything at first. She just stared at him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for the truth. After a long moment, she finally spoke. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. Jake nodded, though he didn't feel like he deserved her thanks. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who had made a lot of mistakes, who had seen too much of the world's darkness. But for Mia, he would try. For her, he would fight the darkness inside of himself. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "Just stay safe. That's all that matters." The words felt strange coming from him, but they were true. And for the first time in years, Jake felt like maybe, just maybe, he could be something better. The next few days passed in a blur for Jake and Mia. The cold garage became a temporary refuge for the girl, her small presence a reminder of everything Jake had long tried to bury. Mia was quiet, but the occasional glance or shy smile would remind him that she was still a child, still learning to trust, and still fragile in the face of everything that had happened to her. Jake didn't push her to talk. He had learned the hard way that trust couldn't be forced. It had to be earned, slowly, piece by piece. He kept his distance, but in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but think about what had happened to her. Who were those men? Why was she out there alone in the first place? But those questions were too dangerous to ask too soon. He needed to keep her safe, at least for now. The days were spent with Jake working on his bikes, as usual. The low hum of the engine, the smell of oil and metal, it was the only thing that made sense in his world. He'd rebuilt his life around this garage, around the sound of grinding metal and the warmth of the engine's hum. But now, every time he worked on a bike, his mind would drift back to Mia, to the fear in her eyes. She was a child, innocent, caught in the middle of a world she didn't belong to. Jake had made it his mission to protect her, but he knew that the world wasn't kind to people like him. He was a Hell's Angel, a man who had earned his reputation with blood, a man who had seen too many dark things in his life to ever believe in a happy ending. But Mia was different. There was something about her, something pure that made him want to change, to be better. Late one night, as Jake finished up some work on an old chopper in the back of the garage, Mia walked in, her small figure silhouetted against the light from the open door. She looked tired, but there was something different about her tonight. She was standing straighter, her eyes not as fearful. It was the first time in days that she had looked at him without that air of suspicion. She cleared her throat softly. "Jake?" she asked, her voice small but stronger than before. Jake turned from the bike and wiped his hands on a rag. "Yeah." He was surprised at how quickly his heart rate picked up at the sound of her voice. It had been so quiet between them, and he hadn't expected her to speak up now. I don't want to stay here forever." Mia's words hit him harder than he anticipated. He stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He had known that this day would come, the moment when she would want to leave, to move on, but hearing her say it out loud made it real. "I know, kid," he said softly. "I know. But you're safe here, for now." Mia looked down at the floor for a long moment, as if contemplating something heavy. "Do you ever feel like you've done so much bad stuff that you can't make it right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake felt the weight of her question settle in his chest. He couldn't lie to her. He had done things in his past that he could never undo, things that haunted him every day. But Mia didn't need to hear the details. She didn't need to know the ugly parts of his life. She needed hope, and maybe, just maybe, he could give her that. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "But it's never too late to try and do better." He paused, stepping closer to her. "You're gonna be okay, Mia. No matter what happens, you're gonna be okay." Mia lifted her head and looked at him, a quiet strength in her eyes that reminded Jake of his grandmother, the woman who had taken him in all those years ago, who had shown him kindness when the world had shown him nothing but pain. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he might actually be able to protect someone, truly protect them, not just with force, but with care. Mia nodded slowly, still unsure, but trusting him enough to stay. Jake stepped back, rubbing his hand over his face. He wasn't sure what would come next. He had no answers for her, no grand plans for a future. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let anything happen to this little girl, not while he was around. As the days went by, the silence between them began to fade. Mia started to help around the garage, picking up tools, handing Jake wrenches when he needed them, silently becoming a part of his world in a way that made it feel more human. She wasn't just the scared little girl who had stumbled into his life. She was becoming something more. She was becoming a reminder of what it meant to care. The dark cloud that had hung over Jake for so long, the weight of his past, began to lift just a little bit with each passing day. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself feel the possibility of something better. Mia wasn't the only one who needed healing. They both did, but they would do it together. Just when Jake thought he was getting used to this quiet life, just when he thought the worst was behind them, a knock on the door broke the silence. It was faint, but unmistakable. Jake's heart sank as he glanced at Mia. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice suddenly tense. He stepped toward the door, but before he could reach it, the knock came again, louder this time. He knew who it was. The past had finally caught up with him. Jake's hand paused just before he reached the door. The knock had come again, louder and more urgent this time, rattling the old wooden frame of the garage. He could feel his heart rate pick up, a familiar tension rising in his chest. He glanced back at Mia, who was standing in the doorway of the small office, her eyes wide with fear. She had heard the knock too. "Stay inside," Jake said, his voice firm but soft enough to not alarm her further. His instincts were on high alert. He wasn't ready for this. He had hoped the past, the things he had done, would stay buried. But it was clear that wasn't the case. Slowly, Jake walked toward the door, each step heavy with the weight of the moment. The knocking came again, louder now, followed by the sound of a voice calling out. "Jake, we know you're in there. Open up." The voice was gruff, unmistakable. Jake recognized it instantly. It was Viper, the president of his old chapter. Jake's stomach twisted. He had been expecting this, but that didn't make it any easier. He had left that life behind, had walked away from the Hell's Angels for good. But Viper wasn't the kind of man who let people go without a fight. He was the kind of man who demanded loyalty, no matter the cost. Jake stood still for a moment, weighing his options. He could ignore the knock, try to pretend he wasn't here, but that would only delay the inevitable. Viper wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. Or Jake could face it head on. He didn't owe Viper anything anymore, but he owed it to Mia to keep her safe. He couldn't let her get caught up in this world again, not after everything she had been through. Taking a deep breath, Jake opened the door. The moment it swung wide, the cold night air rushed in, and Jake was met with the sight of Viper and two other patched members of the Hell's Angels standing on his porch. They were all dressed in their leather cuts, their faces hard and unwelcoming. Viper stepped forward, his eyes narrowing when he saw Jake standing there, his arms crossed. "You've got a lot of nerve, Jake," Viper growled. "You think you can just walk away from everything, from the club, from us? You don't get to leave, not like that." Jake felt a familiar rush of anger rise in him, but he pushed it down. "I'm not part of this anymore, Viper," he said, his voice steady. "I left. I'm done." Viper's eyes flicked toward the open door behind Jake, and for a moment, Jake saw the flicker of something dark in his gaze. "What's she doing here?" Viper's voice was low, dangerous. Jake's stomach twisted. He knew exactly who Viper was talking about. "She's not part of this," Jake said quickly, stepping in front of the door. "Mia doesn't have anything to do with the club. She's just a kid who got caught up in something she shouldn't have." Viper's lip curled into a sneer. "A kid? You're really gonna play the protector now, Jake? You used to be one of us. You don't get to walk away from the life, not without consequences." "I'm not your soldier anymore," Jake said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm not doing this anymore. You're not dragging me back into that world." Viper's expression darkened, and for a moment, Jake thought he might strike him. But then Viper stepped back, his eyes scanning Jake's face. "You're a fool, Jake," he spat. "You think you can hide from us? From what you've done? The club never forgets, and neither do I." Jake didn't flinch, even as Viper's words hit home. He had done things for the club that would follow him for the rest of his life, things that couldn't be erased. But that was the past, and he was done with it. He had a chance at something better now. He wasn't going to let Viper or anyone else take that away from him. "Get off my property, Viper," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not coming back. And if you try to force me, it's not going to end well for you." Viper hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if weighing his options. But after a long moment, he scoffed. "You're not worth my time, Jake. You're nothing now. You think you can hide out here in this rundown garage with your little girl? Fine. But don't think this is over." He turned on his heel, signaling for the others to follow. "We'll be back. You haven't seen the last of us." As the men walked away, Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He quickly shut the door and locked it, leaning against it for a moment. The adrenaline from the confrontation still surged through him, but now that it was over, a wave of exhaustion hit him. He turned to find Mia standing in the doorway of the small office, her wide eyes filled with concern. "Jake, who were they? What do they want with you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jake pushed himself off the door and walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "They were just some people from my past. People I used to run with." He paused, searching for the right words. "But you don't need to worry about them, Mia. I'm here to protect you. And I will, no matter what." Mia didn't say anything at first. She just nodded slowly, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. She had been through too much already, and he wasn't sure how much more she could take. But he wasn't going to let her go through it alone. He would face his past, his demons, if it meant keeping her safe. "Come on," Jake said, his voice softer now. "Let's get you something to eat. We've got a long road ahead, and I'm not letting anyone hurt you." The morning light filtered through the grime-covered windows of the garage, casting long shadows across the room. Jake sat at the workbench, his hands busy with the motorcycle engine, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest after the encounter with Viper and the others. He had known the club wouldn't let him go easily, but he hadn't expected them to show up so soon. His past was never going to stay buried, not as long as men like Viper were still out there. Jake tightened the bolt on the engine, his hands moving mechanically, trying to focus on something, anything, to keep his mind off the looming threat. But it was hard. Every little sound in the garage felt like a warning. Every shadow seemed to hide danger. He had never been this vulnerable, not since he left the military, not since he joined the Hells Angels. "You can't outrun your past," he muttered to himself. The door to the office creaked open, and Mia stepped in, her small figure hesitant in the doorway. She had been quiet all morning, the events from the night before still hanging in the air between them. Jake looked up, meeting her gaze. "Everything okay?" he asked, trying to sound normal, but his voice betrayed the unease he felt. Mia hesitated, then nodded. "I'm okay," she said softly, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of the men who had attacked her. It was the fear of the unknown. She didn't know what was coming, and neither did Jake. "I was just thinking," Mia continued, her voice quieter now. "What if they come back? What if they hurt you?" Jake stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. He walked over to her and knelt down to her level, looking her in the eyes. "They won't hurt me," he said, though even he wasn't entirely sure of that. "I won't let them." Mia looked uncertain, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she just nodded. Jake's heart clenched. He had spent so much of his life hardened, closed off to everyone and everything. But with Mia, it was different. She needed him, and that gave him a reason to fight. He wasn't sure what he was fighting for yet. His own redemption, maybe, or just the hope that he could be something better for her. The sound of a motorcycle engine roaring outside pulled Jake from his thoughts. His head snapped toward the window, his body tensing. It wasn't the sound of Viper's crew, but the familiar rumble of his own Harley. For a moment, Jake stood frozen, unsure whether to go outside or stay hidden. He couldn't afford to take any chances. But Mia was still looking at him, waiting for him to lead. And as much as he hated to admit it, he needed to take control. Slowly, he walked over to the door and opened it just enough to peer outside. The sight of the motorcycle in the parking lot sent a wave of relief through him. It wasn't Viper. It was Murphy, the old mechanic from the garage down the street. He had been a mentor to Jake years ago, back when Jake was just getting out of the army and trying to find his way. Murphy was a good man, and if anyone could help him with what was coming, it was him. Jake stepped outside and waved. Murphy saw him and slowly walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. The older man's face was lined with age, his gray beard a stark contrast to the youthful spark in his eyes. He looked up at the garage, his gaze lingering on the bike that Jake had been working on. "Been keeping busy, I see," Murphy said with a half-smile. "You still got that knack for fixing things, huh?" Jake returned the smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just trying to keep my head down." Murphy's expression shifted, sensing the tension in Jake's voice. "You okay?" Jake hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, just dealing with some old ghosts." Murphy's eyes narrowed. He had known Jake long enough to know when he wasn't being completely honest. but he didn't press. Instead, he changed the subject. You need help with that bike? Jake looked over at the partially assembled motorcycle, then back at Murphy. Yeah, I could use a hand. Got a lot on my plate right now. Murphy nodded, walking over to the workbench. All right, let's see what we've got here. As they worked together on the bike, Jake found himself talking less and less, letting the familiar rhythm of the work calm him. The sound of tools clinking, the smell of grease and oil, it was all so grounding, so comforting. But even as they worked, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse. Viper wasn't going to let this go, and Jake wasn't sure if he was ready for the fight that was coming. After a while, the two men took a break, sitting on an old crate in the corner of the garage. Murphy lit a cigarette, his eyes scanning the garage like he was trying to make sense of something. So what's really going on, Jake? Murphy asked, the question hanging in the air. Jake sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. It's the club. Viper's crew. They want me back. They're not going to stop until they get what they want. Murphy leaned back, taking a long drag from his cigarette. I figured as much. They don't let their own walk away easily. Jake nodded, looking at the floor. Yeah, I'm trying to keep Mia safe. I'm trying to do the right thing, but I don't know if I can protect her from them. Murphy looked over at him, his expression serious. You've got something to fight for now, Jake. That makes all the difference. Jake met his eyes, a sense of determination building in him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this fight. They would have to face whatever was coming together. And he would protect Mia, no matter what it took. The days after the confrontation with Viper were tense, every shadow in the garage feeling like a threat. Jake kept to his routine, working on bikes, keeping his hands busy, but his mind was never at ease. He couldn't shake the feeling that the next time Viper came, it wouldn't be just a warning. He had crossed a line, and the Hells Angels didn't forget. But Jake wasn't about to let the past dictate his future, especially not with Mia under his roof. He'd made promises he intended to keep. The garage had become a strange sanctuary for them both. Mia, though quiet and withdrawn at times, was adjusting. She helped Jake with the bikes, small tasks like handing him tools, organizing parts. It wasn't much, but it gave her a sense of purpose, and it kept her mind off the horrors she had seen. Jake had seen that shift in her, a small, hesitant smile here, a bit of laughter there. It was like watching someone begin to come alive again. Yet, the fear in her eyes was never far away. Jake could see it every time the door creaked or when the wind howled too loudly through the broken windows. Mia had every reason to be afraid. It had only been a few days since she had been dragged through the streets by those men. She had been a victim once, and Jake knew it would take more than time to erase that terror. Late one night, as Jake finished tightening a bolt on a Harley-Davidson, the sound of a motorcycle engine interrupted his thoughts. He froze, his muscles tensing as the familiar rumble echoed from outside the garage. It was the same sound he had heard the night Viper and his crew showed up. He stood up, moving toward the door, but then stopped. He glanced back at Mia, who was sitting quietly in the corner of the office, staring at a picture she had found on the floor. Her eyes met his, and she gave him a small nod, as if she understood the unspoken message. Jake didn't want her to worry, didn't want her to be scared, but he couldn't keep her in the dark either. The world they lived in was dangerous, and no matter how hard he tried to shield her from it, danger always had a way of finding its way through. He stepped outside, the chill of the night air hitting his skin like a slap. The bike was parked outside, its lights off, but the engine still running. Jake's heart sank. He knew exactly who it was. He walked toward the bike, his steps deliberate, his mind racing. As he approached, the rider turned off the engine, revealing his face under the helmet. It was Steele, a member of the Hells Angels. He had been Jake's closest friend in the club, the one person Jake had trusted above all others. But that was before he left, before he cut ties with the club. Jake, Steele said, his voice gravelly but familiar. We need to talk. Jake didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what to say. Steele had been like a brother to him, and now, here he was, standing in front of him, a reminder of the life Jake had tried so hard to leave behind. I don't want any trouble, Steele, Jake finally said, his voice low. I told Viper already, I'm out. I'm done with all of it. Steele shook his head, his expression unreadable. It's not that simple, man. You know that. He took off his helmet, revealing the scars and tattoos that marked his life with the Hells Angels. Steele was an older man, but the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. "Viper's pissed, Jake. You walked away, and that doesn't sit right with him. He wants you back. He wants you to come back to the club." Jake felt the weight of Steele's words sink in. He had known that Viper wouldn't let him go easily, but hearing it from Steele made it real. It was never going to be over. "I'm not going back," Jake said firmly. "I've moved on. I've got a life now. A real one. I don't want anything to do with the club anymore." Steele took a deep breath, his face softening just a little. "I get it, Jake. I really do. But you know how Viper is. He won't stop. Not until he gets what he wants." Jake's fists clenched at his sides. He had always known Viper was relentless, but now that relentless force was bearing down on him again. The past was here, knocking on his door, and it wasn't going away. "What do you want from me, Steele?" Jake asked, his voice hardening. Steele glanced toward the garage, his eyes narrowing. "I just want you to be ready. Viper's not going to let this go. He'll come for you. And if he can't get you, he'll come for the people you care about." Jake's chest tightened at the mention of Mia. He had promised to protect her, to keep her safe. And now it seemed like that promise was going to be tested. He had been foolish to think he could just walk away from the club and everything would be fine. He had been living in a dream where he could build a life with Mia, away from the violence, away from the chaos. But the truth was, that life had never really been his. The Hell's Angels had a way of claiming their own. Steele was right. Viper wouldn't stop. Not until he got what he wanted. "Thanks for the warning," Jake said, his voice cold. "But I've got it from here. I'll handle it." Steele nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the garage once more. "Just know, Jake, the club doesn't forget. And Viper's a dangerous man." With that, Steele put his helmet back on, revved his engine, and drove off into the night, leaving Jake standing in the parking lot, staring at the empty road ahead. He didn't have much time. The clock was ticking, and Viper was coming. But Jake wasn't about to let anyone take Mia from him. He would face whatever came next, and he would do whatever it took to protect her. The tension in the garage was thick, the silence louder than ever. Jake sat at the workbench, his hands clenching and unclenching as he tried to focus on the parts in front of him. Steele's warning echoed in his mind, each word a reminder of the past he couldn't escape. Viper was coming. The thought sent a wave of unease through him. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to face the life he thought he'd left behind. But there was no more running. He couldn't outrun his past, especially now that Mia was involved. He had to protect her, no matter the cost. He glanced over at her, sitting quietly in the corner, her eyes focused on something he couldn't see. She had been so quiet since the encounter with Steele, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. The last thing Jake wanted was for her to feel like she was a burden, but he knew she was scared. They both were. The door to the garage creaked open, and Mia stood up slowly, walking over to him. She didn't say anything at first, but Jake could see the questions in her eyes. She wanted to know what was going to happen next. "Jake," she said softly, her voice breaking the stillness. He looked up at her, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "Yeah?" he asked, his voice low. Mia hesitated for a moment before speaking. "What's going to happen now? Are they going to hurt us?" Her words hit him harder than he expected. He wanted to tell her that everything would be fine, that she didn't have to worry. But that wouldn't be the truth. He didn't know what was going to happen. He didn't know if he could protect her from the Hells Angels or from the past he had tried so hard to escape. But he couldn't show her fear. Not now. Not when she was looking to him for reassurance. "No," he said firmly, trying to make his voice steady. "They're not going to hurt you. I won't let them." Mia looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. He could see the fear still in her, but there was something else too, a flicker of trust. He didn't want to let her down. He had made promises to her, promises to protect her, and he would keep them, no matter what. He stood up, walking over to her. "Listen, Mia," he said, his voice softer now. "There's something I have to do, something I have to face. But I'm not going anywhere. I'll be right here, and I'm not letting anyone take you away from me. I promise." Mia nodded slowly, though her expression remained uncertain. She wasn't just a scared little girl anymore. She had seen things no child should have to see. And Jake knew that this would change her, no matter how much he tried to shield her from it. "I trust you, Jake," she said quietly. Her words were simple, but they were everything to him. He didn't deserve her trust, but hearing it made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he could do something right. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice steady. "We'll face it together. You and me." The door slammed open again, interrupting their moment. Jake's body tensed immediately as he turned toward the door, his instincts on high alert. He could feel the shift in the air. Someone was here, and this time, it wasn't steel. A figure stepped into the garage, a man with a heavy build and a face that looked familiar, but Jake couldn't place him at first. The man didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching Jake. His eyes were cold, calculating. Jake took a step back, his hand instinctively moving toward the wrench on the workbench, ready for whatever was coming. "I've been looking for you, Jake," the man finally spoke, his voice low and threatening. It wasn't a voice Jake recognized, but the accent was unmistakable. This man was a part of Viper's crew. "Viper wants you back. He's not done with you." Jake's heart sank. He knew this was coming. He knew Viper wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. But Jake wasn't going back. Not now. Not after everything he had fought for. "I'm not coming back," Jake said, his voice cold, firm. The man chuckled, a harsh, grating sound that made the hairs on the back of Jake's neck stand up. "You think you have a choice?" the man sneered. "You think you can just walk away from this life, from the club, and everything will be fine?" Viper doesn't forget. Jake's jaw clenched. He had made his choice a long time ago, and there was no going back. "You're wasting your time," Jake said, taking a step forward. "I'm not part of the Hell's Angels anymore, and I'm not afraid of Viper. Tell him to come for me if he wants, but I'm not going anywhere." The man's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching toward the gun at his side. But before he could reach for it, Jake stepped forward quickly, his hand already gripping the man's wrist in a swift, practiced move. The man grunted in surprise, but Jake had him. "You think Viper can scare me?" Jake hissed. "I've seen worse than him. If he wants me, he'll have to come through me first." The man's eyes flicked to Mia, who was standing quietly in the corner, watching with wide eyes. Jake's heart tightened at the sight of her. She shouldn't have to see this. She shouldn't have to be caught in the middle of his mess. "Get out," Jake said, his voice cold. "Tell Viper I'm not his anymore. And tell him if he comes here, he's going to regret it." The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes lingering on Jake and Mia, before he finally stepped back. "You'll regret this, Jake. Viper doesn't forgive." With that, the man turned and left, slamming the door behind him. Jake stood there, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He had just made things worse. Viper wasn't going to let this go, but neither was Jake. Not when Mia was in danger. He wasn't going to let anyone take her from him. Not now. Not ever. Jake stood in the garage long after the man had left, his mind racing. The encounter had only escalated things. Viper wasn't going to stop now, and neither was the weight of the past he had tried to outrun. He looked over at Mia, who was still standing in the corner, her eyes wide with fear. She hadn't moved, hadn't said anything since the man had left. Jake could feel the cold tension in the air, and for a moment, he wasn't sure what to say to her. He had promised to keep her safe, but the truth was, he wasn't sure how to do that. The Hell's Angels were coming for him, and it wasn't just the club. It was Viper, the man who had once been his closest brother, the man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. "Jake!" Mia's voice broke the silence, soft but full of worry. He turned to face her, his heart heavy. She was looking at him like she was waiting for something, waiting for him to make it all okay. But he didn't have all the answers. "You don't have to worry about them," Jake said, trying to make his voice sound reassuring. "I'll handle it. I promise you." Mia looked at him, her brow furrowed with uncertainty. "I don't want you to fight them," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't want you to get hurt." Jake's chest tightened at her words. He had spent so much of his life trying to protect people, trying to be the one who kept everyone else safe. But Mia was different. She wasn't just anyone. She was everything to him now. He couldn't afford to lose her. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," Jake said, his voice firm. "No matter what. You're safe here. I'll make sure of it." Mia's eyes welled with tears, and Jake felt a pang of guilt. He hated seeing her like this, scared and unsure. She had already been through so much. He wanted to give her peace, but he knew it wouldn't be that easy. The door to the garage suddenly creaked open again, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. His hand went to the gun tucked in the waistband of his jeans, his body tense, ready for whatever was coming next. But this time, it wasn't a threat. It was Murphy, the old mechanic from down the street, walking into the garage with his usual calm presence. Murphy's gruff voice broke through the tension. "Jake, I knew I'd find you here." Jake let out a sigh of relief, his hand dropping from the gun. "Murphy, what are you doing here?" "Thought you could use some backup," Murphy said, his eyes flicking over to Mia, who was still standing in the corner. "I heard what went down last night. Viper's crew, huh?" Jake nodded grimly. "Yeah, they're not going away. Viper's got a score to settle, and I'm in his sights." Murphy shook his head. "You're not the only one they've got their eye on, Jake. The club doesn't forget. And Viper? He's got a vendetta." "I know," Jake said, his voice low. "I've been trying to keep Mia out of it, but I'm not sure how long that's gonna last." Murphy glanced at Mia again, his expression softening. "You're doing your best, kid," he said, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "But you're right about one thing. Viper's not gonna stop until he gets what he wants. And it's not just you he's after. He'll come for anyone you care about." Jake's stomach churned. He had known the stakes were high, but hearing it from Murphy made it feel all too real. The past wasn't just coming for him. It was coming for Mia too. "So what do I do now?" Jake asked, his voice tight with frustration. "How do I protect her if they keep coming?" Murphy took a long, thoughtful breath before speaking. "You can't protect her from everything. But you can be ready. You can stand your ground." He stepped closer to Jake, his expression turning serious. "You can't run anymore, Jake. Not with Mia in the picture. If you want to keep her safe, you've got to take the fight to them. You've got to show Viper that you're not the same man you were. You're stronger now. You've got something to lose." Jake's chest tightened, the weight of Murphy's words sinking in. He had something to lose now, someone to protect. For the first time in his life, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about doing whatever it took to keep Mia safe. The Hell's Angels might be coming for him, but Jake wasn't going to let them take her. "I'm not going anywhere," Jake said firmly. "I'll fight. I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe." Murphy gave him a nod of approval. "That's the spirit. But remember, Jake, it's not just about fighting. It's about outsmarting them. Viper's a smart man, but he doesn't know everything. You've got the advantage." Jake looked at Mia, still standing quietly in the corner. She had heard every word, and she was looking at him with that same trust in her eyes. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for her. "Thank you," Jake said to Murphy, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Murphy smiled faintly. "You don't have to thank me. You've always been one of us. I'm just making sure you remember that." Jake nodded, turning back toward the workbench. He felt a sense of resolve settle over him. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But he wasn't alone anymore. He had Murphy, and most importantly, he had Mia. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt ready for what was to come. He wasn't going to let Viper or anyone else take her from him. No one was going to break his family. Not now. Not ever. The tension was thick in the garage. Jake could feel it in the air, the weight of what was coming pressing down on him. He had no illusions about what was ahead. Viper wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. And Jake was already feeling the pull of the past trying to drag him back into the life he had left behind. He had been a Hell's Angel, a part of something dark and dangerous. But now, the only thing that mattered was Mia. He had promised her safety, and he wasn't going to break that promise. The silence between Jake and Mia stretched on, both of them thinking about what the future might hold. He had been trying to shield her from the danger he knew was coming, but there was no hiding from it now. It was time to face it head on. He glanced at her, sitting quietly in the corner, her small frame barely visible in the dim light of the garage. She had been through so much already, and Jake hated that she had to be caught up in his mess. "You know what's coming, don't you?" Jake asked, his voice low. Mia didn't answer right away. Instead, she nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his with an understanding that broke his heart. "I don't want you to get hurt," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake walked over to her, kneeling down to meet her eye level. His hand rested on her shoulder, the warmth of it a small comfort in the cold, tense air. "You won't get hurt," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I won't let them take you. Not now. Not ever." Mia didn't say anything else, but Jake could see the trust in her eyes. It made him feel like he was doing something right, something worth fighting for. He knew he couldn't protect her from everything, but he would do his damnedest to keep her safe. The sound of motorcycles approaching from down the street broke their moment of quiet. Jake's heart skipped a beat, and he stood up quickly, his instincts kicking in. He walked to the door and peeked out, his eyes scanning the street. He could see them, Viper's crew. They had come, just like he had known they would. His stomach twisted as he turned back to Mia. "Stay inside," he said, his voice hard, but the concern for her was evident. "Don't come out no matter what." She nodded, but the uncertainty in her eyes told him that she wasn't sure if he could keep his promise. Jake walked out to meet the crew, his steps purposeful. He wasn't going to back down this time. He had already made his choice. The life he had left behind was never going to let him go, but that didn't mean he had to go back to it. "Viper," Jake said, his voice steady as he faced the man who had once been like a brother to him. Viper stood a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes cold and calculating. "You should have come back, Jake," Viper said, his voice gruff. "You know that. You can't just walk away from the club. We're family." Jake shook his head, his jaw clenched. "I'm not part of this anymore, Viper. I've moved on." Viper's eyes narrowed. "You think it's that simple? You think you can just walk away and live your little quiet life?" Viper took a step forward, his voice growing harder. "You're a Hell's Angel, Jake. You always will be. You don't get to decide that." Jake's fists clenched at his sides, the old anger flaring up again, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm done with the club, and I'm done with you." Viper's eyes flashed with anger. "You think you're untouchable now? You think you can just turn your back on everything we've built? You've got a lot to learn, Jake." Jake felt his heart racing as he took a step closer to Viper. He wasn't going to let him intimidate him again. Not this time. "You don't scare me anymore," Jake said, his voice low and cold. "I'm not that man anymore. And if you try to hurt Mia, I'll make sure you regret it." The crew behind Viper shifted, their eyes flicking between Jake and their leader. Viper glared at Jake for a long moment before he let out a harsh laugh. "You're right about one thing," Viper said. "You're not that man anymore. You're weak. And that's why you're going to lose." Viper stepped back, signaling for his crew to follow. "We'll be back, Jake. You can't run forever." Jake didn't move as they left, his body tense, his mind racing. He had made it clear to Viper that he wasn't coming back, but Jake knew that wasn't enough. Viper wouldn't stop. Not until he had what he wanted. But Jake wasn't going to let that happen. Not again. Not this time. As the sound of the bikes faded into the distance, Jake turned and walked back inside. Mia was waiting for him, her eyes wide with concern. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake smiled at her, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's over. For now." Mia looked at him with a mixture of relief and worry. "But they're not going to leave, are they?" she asked quietly. Jake shook his head. "No, they won't. But I won't let them hurt you." Mia's face softened, and for the first time in a long time, Jake saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She trusted him, and that was all that mattered. He wasn't going to let her down. The days following Viper's visit were tense, and Jake could feel the weight of the coming storm. The past was knocking harder now, and no matter how much he tried to bury it, it was always right there, just waiting to drag him back into the mess he had fought so hard to escape. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not with Mia under his roof. He had promised to keep her safe, and no matter what happened, he was going to keep that promise. Mia had been quiet since the encounter. She stayed close to him, but Jake could tell that the fear still lingered in her eyes. It wasn't just the men who had attacked her, but the constant uncertainty of what was coming next. Jake's life had never been easy, but now, with Mia involved, it felt like everything was more fragile than ever. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for her. That thought consumed him. And yet, as much as he tried to shield her from the danger that was closing in on them, he knew that he couldn't protect her from everything. The knock on the door came late one evening. It was a soft sound, almost like a whisper against the quiet of the night, but it was enough to make Jake's heart race. He turned to Mia, who was sitting on the couch, her eyes wide with fear. She had heard it too. Without a word, Jake stood up and walked toward the door, his body tense, his mind running through every possible scenario. He didn't know who it was. He didn't care. All he cared about was making sure Mia was safe. As he reached the door, the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Jake hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the door handle, but he couldn't stand the silence any longer. He opened the door, his body ready for whatever was on the other side. To his surprise, it wasn't Viper. It wasn't anyone from the Hell's Angels at all. It was a woman. She was standing there, drenched from the rain, her face hidden beneath the hood of a dark coat. Jake didn't recognize her, but something about the way she stood there, like she was waiting for permission to enter, made him pause. "Can I help you?" Jake asked, his voice guarded. The woman looked up, her eyes tired, haunted. "I'm looking for Jake Morrison," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is he here?" Jake felt his heart skip a beat. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't heard that name in years. He had hoped he'd never hear it again. But here it was, knocking on his door. "I'm Jake," he said, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "Who are you?" The woman hesitated for a moment, then pulled the hood from her head, revealing a face Jake knew all too well. It was Sarah, his ex-wife. His stomach twisted at the sight of her. The last time he had seen her, they had been on opposite sides of a broken marriage, a marriage destroyed by the lies, the violence, and the endless turmoil of the life he had chosen. But now, standing in front of him, she looked older, wearier, and more broken than he remembered. "Sarah," Jake said, his voice filled with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing here?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Jake thought she was going to break down. "I need your help, Jake," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know where else to go." Jake stood there, frozen, unsure of what to say. He hadn't seen her in years, hadn't spoken to her since they had parted ways. And now, here she was, standing in his doorway, asking for his help. He wanted to turn her away. He wanted to tell her to leave and never come back. But the old feelings were still there, buried deep beneath the anger and resentment. She was still the woman he had once loved, the woman he had once promised to protect. But that was a long time ago. "What happened?" Jake asked, his voice low, wary. "Why are you here?" Sarah's hands shook as she reached into her bag and pulled out a small piece of paper. She handed it to Jake, her eyes pleading. "I've been trying to get away from them," she said, her voice breaking. "But they found me. They know where I am, Jake. And I'm scared. I'm so scared." Jake unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the words quickly. It was a note, written in a handwriting he didn't recognize, but the words were clear. "We know where you are. You can't hide forever." Jake's heart sank. The Hells Angels. They had found Sarah. He had no idea how they had tracked her down, but the fact that they had meant one thing. Viper wasn't done with him. He was coming for him, and for anyone Jake cared about. "They're coming for me," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "They want me to come back. But I can't, Jake. I can't go back to that life." Jake's mind raced as he processed her words. He had tried to leave that world behind, to start fresh with Mia, but now it was all crashing down around him. He couldn't protect her from this. He couldn't protect Sarah either. He had made a life for himself, a life that didn't involve the Hells Angels, but it seemed like they weren't ready to let him go. "You can't stay here," Jake said, his voice firm. "You're putting Mia in danger." Sarah looked at him, her eyes pleading. "Please, Jake. I don't know what to do. I have nowhere else to go." Jake's mind was spinning. He couldn't just throw her out. She was his past, his mistake, but she was still someone he had once cared about. And now, Mia was caught in the middle of it all. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let history repeat itself. "Stay inside," Jake said, his voice steady but firm. "I'll take care of this. I'll fix this." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and fear. As she stepped inside, Jake shut the door behind her and locked it, his mind already racing with plans. He had to act fast. Viper wasn't going to wait, and neither was the danger that was closing in on them. He wasn't sure what he was going to do next, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let them take Sarah or Mia from him. Not now. Not ever. Jake sat in the small, dimly lit garage, the only sound the faint hum of his own breathing and the occasional creak of the old building. His hands were still, resting on the table in front of him, as his mind raced. Sarah was inside, trying to calm herself after everything she had said. Mia was in the corner, staring out at the night, her face reflecting both the uncertainty and the fear she had been carrying ever since the moment she entered his life. Jake had always been a man of action, a man who thrived on quick decisions, who faced danger head-on without hesitation. But now, with Sarah's reappearance, everything felt different. The past was closing in on him, and it was pulling Mia into the mess he had spent. Years trying to escape. The Hells Angels. Viper. The life he had left behind was knocking on his door, demanding he return. But Jake wasn't going back. Not for anyone. Not even for Sarah, no matter how much history they shared. He had made a new life, a life that was worth fighting for, and that life was with Mia now. He couldn't let anyone take her away from him. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. His body tensed instinctively, but he didn't need to look to know who it was. Murphy, the only other person who knew about his past, the only one who could understand the weight Jake was carrying. Jake stood up and opened the door. Murphy walked in, his usual calm demeanor barely hiding the concern in his eyes. "You okay?" Murphy asked, his voice quiet but direct. Jake didn't answer immediately. He stepped aside, letting Murphy in. "It's getting bad, isn't it?" Jake finally said, his voice low. Murphy nodded, his face grim. "You can't hide from it forever, Jake. I told you before, Viper doesn't forget." Jake rubbed his face with his hand, frustration building in his chest. I know, he muttered. "But I'm not going back. I'm not doing it. Not for anyone." Murphy leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "You've got to be ready, Jake. The club's not going to stop. Viper will come for you, and when he does, it's going to be a fight you won't win unless you're ready." Jake nodded, but there was a part of him that wanted to fight back, to stand firm and not give in to the world that wanted to drag him back into its darkness. But Mia was here, and he couldn't risk her getting caught in the middle of it. "I can't let them hurt her," Jake said, his voice tight with emotion. Murphy's eyes softened. "I know, Jake. I know you'll do whatever it takes to protect her. But you've got to face this head on. You can't protect her if you're hiding in here. Viper's coming, and you're going to have to fight him, no matter what." Jake clenched his fists at his sides. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to be that person again. But for Mia, he had to be. For her safety. For her future. "What do I do?" Jake asked, his voice low, almost defeated. Murphy straightened up, his tone turning serious. "You don't just fight, Jake. You outsmart them. You find a way to use their weakness against them. You've been in the game long enough to know how this works." Jake took a deep breath, trying to process Murphy's words. He had spent his life running from the consequences of his actions, trying to distance himself from the violence that had defined him. But now, he couldn't run anymore. Not if he wanted to keep Mia safe. "I need to get to them before they get to me," Jake said, his voice gaining strength. Murphy nodded. "Exactly. You've got to stay one step ahead of them. Viper won't expect it." Jake felt a spark of determination light up inside him. He wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't going to let Viper take back what he had fought so hard to build. "I won't let them hurt her," Jake said, his voice firm. Murphy slapped him on the back, giving him a rare grin. "That's the Jake I know." Jake stepped back toward the door, his mind already working, planning his next move. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't keep hiding, waiting for the inevitable. It was time to take control. He had a plan, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Viper had people everywhere, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. But Jake was done being passive. He was done being the victim. He was going to protect Mia, and if that meant taking on the Hell's Angels head-to-head, then so be it. As he turned to face Murphy, his mind already racing with ideas, he realized something. This wasn't just about keeping Mia safe anymore. This was about redemption. This was about proving to himself that he wasn't just a man defined by his past. He could be more than that. He could be the protector he always wanted to be. "Get ready, Murphy," Jake said, his voice steady. "This is just the beginning." Murphy looked at him, his expression serious. "We're with you, Jake. Every step of the way." With that, Jake turned back toward the garage, his mind focused on what was next. He wasn't sure how it was going to play out. He didn't know what the future held. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let his past control him anymore. He was going to take back his life. And he was going to fight for Mia with everything he had. The night after Jake's conversation with Murphy, the tension in the garage was unbearable. Jake could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the weight of the decision he had made, the uncertainty of the battle ahead. Viper was coming, and there was no escaping it. The Hell's Angels were relentless, and Jake had made it clear he wasn't going back, but now he would have to pay the price for that decision. He had already promised Mia that he would protect her, and as the threat loomed closer, the urgency of that promise grew. Every movement in the garage, every creak of the floorboards, made his senses sharpen. His hand instinctively moved to the gun tucked in his waistband. He wasn't a man who liked guns, never had been. But this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. He glanced over at Mia, who was sitting quietly, drawing in her notebook. She didn't say much, but Jake could see the concern in her eyes. She was trying to hold it together, to stay strong for him, but he knew the weight of fear was crushing her. It had only been a few weeks since she had stumbled into his life, but in that short time, everything had changed. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for her. The past was knocking on his door, but Mia was the future, and there was no way in hell he was going to let anyone take that from him. A soft knock at the door broke his train of thought. His body tensed, but he didn't move. He knew who it was before they even spoke. Murphy had said he'd come back, and Jake had half expected him to show up at some point. Jake's hand relaxed on the gun, but his mind was still racing. The Hell's Angels had already sent their message, and now it was time to act. The knock came again, this time louder, more urgent. With a quick breath, Jake stood and walked to the door, his footsteps steady but filled with purpose. When he opened it, Murphy was standing there, a grim expression on his face. "It's time, Jake," Murphy said, his voice low, and filled with the gravity of the situation. "Viper's crew is out there. They've got eyes on you." Jake stepped aside, allowing Murphy to enter. The old mechanic didn't waste any time. "You've been right to prepare. But now it's more than just hiding. You've got to make a stand." Jake nodded, the familiar weight of the decision pressing on him. "I'm ready," he said, his voice firm. "I won't let them take Mia." Murphy walked over to the workbench, where Jake had laid out everything he would need for the fight ahead. "You've got a plan?" Murphy asked, his eyes scanning the tools. Jake's mind raced through the possibilities, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to fight Viper and his crew on their terms. "I've been thinking about it," Jake said. "I'm not going to sit here and wait for them to make the first move. I'll go after them, find their weak spots, and I'll use everything I've learned." Murphy smiled, though it was a small one. "That's the Jake I know. You've got the right mind for this. But you've got to stay sharp. They won't stop until they get what they want." Jake turned, meeting Murphy's eyes. "They're not getting anything from me, and they sure as hell aren't getting to Mia." Murphy nodded. "I'll be here to help. But you've got to handle Viper. You've got to show him that you're not the same man who walked away." Jake didn't respond immediately. His mind was already racing through the next steps, the next moves in a game that had always been a losing one. But he wasn't playing that game anymore. He was changing the rules. As the plan began to take shape in his mind, Jake's focus narrowed. This wasn't just about the fight with Viper. It was about something bigger. He wasn't just going to face down his old life. He was going to destroy it. Viper was going to learn the hard way that Jake Morrison was no longer the man who followed orders, no longer the man who did the club's bidding. He was someone else now, and he was ready to show the world who he had become. "Get ready," Jake said, looking over at Mia, who had quietly entered the room, standing in the doorway. "This isn't over yet, but we're going to make it through. I promise." Mia nodded, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Jake could see the fear in her, but he also saw the trust. She was counting on him, and for the first time in a long time, Jake didn't mind carrying that weight. He walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're in this together, Mia. I'm not going anywhere." Mia looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "I believe you, Jake." For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was doing the right thing. He wasn't just hiding. He wasn't just trying to survive. He was fighting for a future, for a family he hadn't thought possible. And nothing, not even Viper, was going to take that away from him. As he turned back to Murphy, he could feel the weight of the moment settling over him. This was it. The final fight. The Hell's Angels had come for him. But Jake Morrison wasn't the man he used to be, and he was going to prove that tonight. The night was still, the tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Jake stood in the garage, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had prepared for this, but nothing could truly prepare him for the fight that was coming. Viper and his crew were out there, circling like vultures, waiting for the moment to strike. But Jake wasn't afraid anymore. He had made his choice, and he wasn't going to back down. He wasn't the same man he used to be, and for the first time in his life, he was fighting for something that mattered more than his own survival. Mia was asleep in the corner of the garage, curled up on the couch under a blanket, her peaceful face a reminder of what he was fighting for. He had promised to protect her, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. He glanced over at Murphy, who was sitting at the workbench, silently watching him, waiting for the inevitable. The older man's eyes were sharp, the wisdom of a life lived through hardship written in every wrinkle on his face. He had been Jake's mentor, his guide through the darkness of the club life. And now, he was here to help him fight his demons. "You ready?" Murphy asked, his voice steady. Jake nodded, his hands tightening around the cold metal of the wrench in his grip. "Yeah," he said, his voice low but sure. "I'm ready." They had spent the last few hours preparing, making sure every detail was accounted for. Jake knew that the fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't going to make the same mistakes again. He had a plan, and it was time to put it into action. The garage was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the engines outside. Jake could feel the pressure building, the anticipation in the air. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he couldn't run anymore. The time for hiding was over. The door to the garage creaked open, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. His hand instinctively went to the gun at his side, but it wasn't Viper. It was Mia, standing in the doorway, her wide eyes filled with concern. "Jake," she said softly, her voice shaking just slightly. "I'm scared." Jake felt a pang in his chest at the sight of her. She had already been through so much, and now she was looking to him for protection. He couldn't let her down. He walked over to her, kneeling down to her level. "You don't have to be scared," he said, his voice as soothing as he could make it. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and trust. "But what if they hurt you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's heart clenched. The truth was, he didn't know what would happen. But he wasn't going to let fear control him. He wasn't going to let it control her. "I'll be okay," Jake said, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." Mia hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, her small hand reaching for his. Jake took it, holding it gently, reassuring her with the strength of his grip. "We're in this together," he said. "I'll protect you, no matter what." Mia nodded, her fear slowly subsiding as she leaned into his side. Jake stood up, looking toward the door, the sound of the motorcycles growing louder, closer. They were coming. It was time. Jake turned to Murphy, who stood up as well, his face set with determination. "Let's finish this," Jake said, his voice filled with resolve. Murphy nodded, his eyes meeting Jake's with a silent understanding. "We'll handle it," he said. The two men walked toward the door, their footsteps steady. Jake took one last look at Mia, who was now standing by the couch, her small figure silhouetted against the dim light of the garage. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone take her away from him. The fight was about to begin. Outside, the engines roared to life as Viper's crew pulled up. Jake could see them in the distance, their bikes lined up like soldiers ready for battle. He took a deep breath, his hand resting on the gun at his side, his mind focused on the task ahead. This was it, the moment he had been dreading, but also the moment he had been waiting for. He wasn't going to let his past control him any longer. He wasn't going to let Viper and the Hells Angels take everything from him again. This time, he would take control of his own fate. The door to the garage opened, and Jake stepped out, Murphy by his side. The cool night air hit him like a wave, but it didn't faze him. He was ready. He walked toward Viper's crew, his steps deliberate and steady, his eyes locked on the leader. Viper stood in front of his men, his arms crossed, his face a mask of contempt. "Jake," he sneered, his voice thick with malice. "You really think you can walk away from this? From us?" Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. Viper took a step forward, his eyes flashing with rage. "You're not getting away this time, Jake. You've got no choice. You're one of us, whether you like it or not." Jake didn't flinch. He didn't back down. This time, he wasn't going to be the man who followed orders. This time, he was going to make his own path. "I'm not one of you anymore," Jake said, his voice firm and cold. "And I'm not going back. Not for you. Not for anyone." Viper's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a snarl. "We'll see about that." And with that, the first blow was struck. The fight had begun, but Jake was ready.